Hello again, everybody. Welcome to our lecture series for Chapter 4 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty, by Dr. Eric Foner. This series is entitled Slavery, Freedom, and the Struggle for Empire to 1763, a very important date, as we shall soon see. The first section of this lecture is entitled Slavery and Empire. The focus question for this section is, how did African slavery differ regionally in 18th century North America? By the 18th century, Atlantic trade had become arguably the most prosperous section of the world economy, and the slave trade was a vital part of that overall Atlantic trade. It really can be compared to the trade in oil and gas today. The labor of enslaved people can be likened to the fuel that ran this Atlantic economy, which helps explain why it was so difficult to end the institution after it had become such a vital part of it. Those triangular trade routes that we have spoken about previously moved people and goods around the Atlantic. And even in areas where slavery was not well developed, the economy benefited from the institution. New England, for example, their farmers fed Caribbean slaves, and that was a vital part of New England's economy. Their shipbuilding industry benefited from the slave trade in building the ships that carried the goods and the people back and forth across the Atlantic. And this whole process of Atlantic trade and these triangular trade patterns slowly but inexorably made slavery more and more entrenched in the Atlantic economy. To understand slavery and the slave trade in its totality, we must take a look at its function in the West African societies from which most of the enslaved peoples originated. Now, slavery in West Africa had a long history, but the European demand for slaves made the slave trade and the institution of slavery in West Africa even more important as a part of the West African economies. Most African rulers and societies were involved in the slave trade to one degree or another, and African kingdoms competed and warred with each other over access and control of this very lucrative trade. This trade made Africa a major market for European manufactured goods, particularly guns, which the West African kingdoms then, of course, used to war with one another to gain more slaves to trade for more European goods. Because of the high demand by Europeans, African societies and economies became more and more entrenched in slavery and the slave trade, and lots of riches were accumulated to many of these African kingdoms because of their participation in this slave trade. Now, the diagram you see here illustrates the volume of the slave trade between the years of 1691 and 1730, a slim snapshot of the overall duration of the slave trade. Now, as you can see, the vast majority of the enslaved from West Africa ended up in either the Caribbean or down in Brazil, where the sugar economy was predominant, and the extremely rigorous labor demands of sugar production, coupled with high death rates, made a constant influx of fresh imports of slaves very vital to the maintenance of the sugar economy. Now, in comparison, you can see up here in the North American region, relatively few slaves were actually imported into the region from West Africa, which points to some of the regional differences in the institution between the Americas, and also indicates one other thing about North America that was unique as far as the institution of slavery in the Americas, and that was the natural increase of the enslaved population here. Another thing that was quite different about the institution in North America compared relatively to the Caribbean and South America. The term given to the voyage of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic by historians is the Middle Passage, so called because it's that middle leg of those triangular trading patterns in the Atlantic that we've been discussing. As you can see from this diagram, which is actually from the early 19th century, enslaved peoples were crammed into very close quarters on very small decks in these ships in order to maximize the profit margins for merchants. Of course, these conditions on these ships were completely unhealthy, completely unsanitary, which led to a rapid spread of disease on these ships. 5 to 20% often died in transit, and occasionally even more than that. This was considered a regrettable but acceptable amount of loss to the merchants that plied this trade, mainly due to the extreme profitability of it. They can make up that loss in the profits that they actually received from those that did survive the voyage across the Atlantic. As we have discussed previously, in the Chesapeake region of Virginia and Maryland, tobacco plantations provided the foundation for the economies there. The global demand for tobacco equaled a growing demand in slaves to work those tobacco fields. And most slaves in Virginia did work in those fields. However, a small percentage was engaged in skilled labor like blacksmithing or carpentry, things of that nature, or domestic labor, work in the household itself. Slavery in Virginia and Maryland provided the foundation for the hierarchical social structure, that pseudo-aristocracy of rich slaveholding planters that sat at the top of society and really pretty much ran everything as they saw fit. As we have previously discussed, the institution of slavery in North America slowly coalesced over time into a more formalized and legalized institution. After Bacon's Rebellion put fear into the elites of the Chesapeake region of a potential alliance between poor whites and blacks that could potentially undermine this hierarchical social structure that had developed in the region over time, legal measures were passed to enhance the power of masters over enslaved people and whites over blacks. And here is where again we start to see ideas of race and racism form and coalesce and become more coherent alongside the growth of the institution of slavery itself. Now, at the heart of the slave system, of course, was violence or the threat of violence. That was the only way it was thought that the entire system could function cohesively. Race took on an increasing importance as a line of social division, and concepts of free and white became virtually identical to each other. Another way to separate out free and slave and white and black and make each term associated with one side or the other. Now, down in the Carolinas, as opposed to tobacco in the Virginias, rice became the dominant crop that fueled the economy in that region. Rice led to expanded economic development, a large-scale importation of slaves, and, like in the Chesapeake region, growing divisions between black and white. Now, ironically, it must be noted that it was actually Africans who taught English settlers how to cultivate rice. Rice cultivation and production had been practiced in West Africa for centuries by that point, and that knowledge was transferred along with the slaves into the Carolina colonies, where the climate was conducive to rice cultivation, and the English planters took advantage of the knowledge of their enslaved populations to develop an expanded rice economy. Now, the work and labor systems in the rice plantations were a little different from what they were in the tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake region. They relied in the Carolinas on what was known as the task system, where the enslaved were assigned daily jobs, a finite, a set amount of work per day, and once they completed that work, they were allowed time for leisure or to cultivate their own crops. Basically, the rest of the day was theirs to use as they saw fit. Now, this was opposed to the gang system, which was used in tobacco production, where entire gangs of slaves were put into the fields and worked from sun up to sunset, or sometimes even longer, to do as much work in the time that was given to them as was possible. Slavery in the northern colonies was quite different from that in the southern colonies. There were no large plantation systems in the north. The climate was not conducive to either tobacco or rice or any other cash crop that required such intensive amounts of labor. So slavery in the New England and the middle colonies was much less central, much less important to the economies of those regions. But that's not necessarily to say that it was marginal to northern colonial life. Now, more lenient laws existed regarding both enslaved populations and the free black population because of the lower numbers of slaves and free blacks made them less of a threat in the eyes of whites. Most of the enslaved population in the North, as opposed to working in the fields on farms, were actually skilled labor, blacksmiths and coopers and carpenters, or domestic workers. In an urban economy that was based on fluctuating trade, wage labor, which allowed for hiring and firing to meet the up and down nature of demand in a free market economy, made more economic sense than slavery. So wage labor quickly developed into the dominant form of labor as opposed to slavery in those northern colonies. That concludes part 1 of our Chapter 4 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.